Okay, hello everybody. I am Tamara Kraker. I'm a coach, facilitator, and speaker on the Enneagram and self-awareness. And today I am joined by my good friend, Kevin Penner. Kevin is a marketing manager in the food services industry and a Winnipeg foodie who will travel far and wide for good food and good conversation. Thank you for joining me, Kevin.
Hi.
I am so excited to have you here. Kevin was one of my first typing interviews that I did with an Enneagram 3. So it is wonderful to have you here to talk about the Enneagram and self-awareness.
I'm
So,
excited too.
okay, wonderful. So let's dive right in. I would love to hear when you first learned your Enneagram type, what was something that stood out to you? What do you remember about that?
Well, I think uh just if I can share, like you actually interviewed myself and my wife,
Mm-hmm.
and that was really cool.
Mm.
To see how we fit, like based on the questions that you were asking, and
Mm.
that yeah, like they were very accurate. Not to say
Mm.
that there isn't a major and a minor per se,
Right.
but the major parts were definitely there. And but more than anything, I think what struck me, being in, marketing. I don't want to say I'm in consulting, but that a large portion of my role, prior to my current role, was doing that.
Sure.
And it's all about question strategy and getting people
Mm.
th thought-provoking questions. And I
Mm.
could just tell, by the information that was, and it was like, wow, I could just see the value in more and
Mm.
more people learning,
Mm.
um, about their type.
I love that. That's been my experience also. So it's so great to hear you say that. So when you think about work, or maybe when you think about personal life, what types of environments do you find bring out the best in you?
Uh, I think a collaborative
Mm.
environment
Mm.
is really important to me. And I realize when some people hear that, they might think, well, obviously, that's like, no, that some people work very well alone.
Hmm.
Not to say that I didn't learn to work alone during the pandemic,
Sure.
um, but I certainly prefer to work in collaboration.
Mm.
I shouldn't say prefer. I'm at my best, I think, when I'm
Mm.
working in collaboration.
Yep.
I think an environment, a supportive environment,
Mm.
but I think that probably most people would say that as well, because I don't think they'd want to work in an
Mm.
unsupportive environment. But
Could you
yeah,
dive into that a little bit? When you
yeah.
say supportive, what types of things are you looking for?
Um, I, for me, it's important. It just because one thing I've learned over the last few years is not just in my company, but like in the marketing role, you do a lot of things that go unnoticed and unappreciated.
Mm. Mm.
And so having a leader or a group of people surrounding you that understand and value
Yeah.
those things,
Yeah.
that's important to me. I know that
Absolutely.
some people don't operate on attaboys that somebody made a joke about, but I just need some acknowledgement and
Yeah.
encouragement. And then what was the other thing I was going to say? I I love feedback,
Mm.
but I like fluid feedback. I
Mm.
don't like waiting a long time and then getting feedback and finding, especially when let's say it's at the end of the year for performance or something, and you find out and you're like, you know, but I also like feedback during my projects, right?
Sure.
Because I like, unless it's my company, which it's not,
Right.
I I I want to hear, I want to get it to where people want it to be, not just what I want to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and that speaks maybe to your collaborative approach, right? You're not
Yeah.
creating something alone.
Yeah.
And so you really want to make sure that everybody's contributing and what you're contributing is valuable.
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely. That makes
Yeah.
so much sense.
Yeah.
My next question is around what gives you energy at work. So, what gives you energy, and maybe often just as important, what drains your energy in a work environment?
So what gives me energy is connection,
Mm.
and
Mm.
definitely human connection. Like, this
Mm.
is great, and I actually really do enjoy this, or
Right.
I've learned to enjoy this, but
Yeah.
nothing can replace the presence of a human being.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and then not only that, but then in those moments, vulnerability, and then I don't want to overuse the term collaboration,
Mm,
but I really love getting down to it because in a
mhm,
lot of cases, you and I've talked about this
mm,
before, it's not what you think.
mm.
Whatever the problem is, it's probably inside and whatever,
Absolutely.
right? And so getting
Absolutely.
to that to me means that we can get to things faster.
Yep.
And then on the flip side, unless you had another question on that, what drains my energy is sitting in front of a computer
Mm,
without interaction,
mm.
um, uh, having to do lots of like reporting and I don't mind these things. I understand
Yep.
that they're a part of the role, but when I
Yep.
do it, I can feel
Mm.
my energy
Right.
drop and lower
Right.
um, when I'm, spend too much time in front of a computer and
Right.
not enough time collaborating and working on things that involve helping people.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we were speaking earlier about the loneliness epidemic, about how that is seems to be the number one issue that's facing workplaces today. And I think you're explaining that in
I couldn't believe hearing that the other day about what psychologists have uncovered, and obviously there's all kinds of data for since the beginning that they were of them tracking it with that human connection is important, and we need to be in connection and that sort of thing. But to find out that it's not necessarily that people aren't motivated. It's
Mhm.
actually that we've become lonely.
Mm.
And it depends on the person's type. Some people certainly can work better in an environment where they're isolated and alone.
Yep.
I'm certainly not one of those people that's at my best in
Right.
that scenario. And buildings, in the most part, not all, but buildings are emptier than they used to be.
Mm.
People in many cases are more, I find, more likely to just want to be alone and not. And
Right.
I think sometimes people are take for granted that the lifestyle that that provides to them. I
Mm.
don't know if they're not necessarily thinking about work and whatever. I think there are some perks to,
Sure.
you know, that lifestyle, but yeah, that's I was really surprised to hear that because I certainly would say that there are times where I would have never thought that, but it's like that
Right.
I feel lonely.
Right. Well, and it's interesting in a post-pandemic world, right? Because we talked about it so much when we were working from home, and a lot of places people are working more in buildings. And so you would think that that would solve it, but clearly there's something under the surface around connection that a lot of workplaces just aren't providing the space for deeper connection.
Well, and I think when I say corporately, I have to be careful how I say that, I guess, but just in larger companies, and not all but many, there's just been so much centralization over the years, and
Mm,
whatever you want to call it, nature of the business or whatever,
mm,
people get people get further and further away from each other,
right,
and spend less and less time near or close to each other in the same office, in the
right,
same building, in the same meetings,
right.
and yeah,
Well, and I guess that's just to wrap this question up, that's
yeah,
where companies need to be intentional about. It's not team building, right?
yeah,
It's
no,
more than just once a quarter we do something together.
yeah,
It's putting those structures in place that actually build connection because
yeah,
it's so necessary to the functioning of every human on your staff.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
The next question is, what's something you know about yourself now that you wish you had known earlier?
I think, uh, gosh, that's big. Work-wise, personal, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
I think they all funnel into the same. I think the I've been through some EMDR therapy,
Hmm.
and that how things were in my life, and when I say growing up or at work, it doesn't. It not just. I'm not referring to just my family or anything like that,
Hmm.
but how that affects everything else in your life
Hmm.
and how you got to work at it.
Hmm.
Just like a relationship, just like a job, just like anything, you got to work at it.
Hmm.
And I wish I had gotten to work on that sooner.
Hmm.
I wish I'd gone inward sooner.
Mm-hmm.
I think like I'm a person that's very comfortable with sharing feelings, being vulnerable. That is different. There is differences
Mm,
than going inward.
right.
I'll never forget when we did our interview and you talked about um looking, I can't remember what it was, looking inward. I don't want to misquote you. But also like listening to that voice
Mm,
and then you said sitting in your feelings and I'm like, what does that mean? And like just understanding now, like starting to get an understanding of what that means and that we don't need to push through. Um, or how, I guess it's not that we don't need to. There are times where we need to make decisions and do things
sure,
and deal with things after the
sure,
fact in some instances.
sure.
But yeah, that idea of creating space
Mm.
and feeling things,
Mm.
yeah, I wish I'd started that sooner.
Hmm. Hmm. That is, I mean, I think that regardless of what type you are, that's a human thing, right? Is the lack of education around emotions up until this point. I think we're definitely getting better at it, especially with the really popular phrase emotional intelligence.
Oh yeah, and I don't think it's the same as emotional intelligence. But don't get me wrong, emotional intelligence is important, but
Right?
it's to me it's different than that.
Well, emotional intelligence really is just a catch-all
Yeah,
for
yeah,
do you feel emotions? Do you know what emotions do to you? Do you know what your emotions do to other people?
yeah. That I think is what most people think emotional
Right?
intelligence is, and it that certainly is. But
Right.
I would have been called very emotionally intelligent by people, but I didn't realize how my interactions with others based on my past or what
Mm,
was stuck inside of me was
right,
affecting the way I was responding, the way I
right,
was feeling, and then in part the way that I was interacting with those people
right,
moving forward.
right. Well, it's layers and layers, right?
Yep.
And if you're
Yep.
not looking at the subconscious layers, are you really looking at the whole story?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final question I have for you, I know it's been too quick. Our little interview has been too quick, but the final question is, what is one piece of advice you'd give to someone who is wired like you?
Well, my go-to is usually like mentoring and accountability,
Mhm.
but I mean, it would depend where the person who is like me
Mhm.
is on their journey, right?
Mm, sure.
So, I think it might actually be a question for the question in that, hey, how much work have you done on yourself? Right?
Sure.
you know
Sure.
and I don't just mean at the gym, you
Right.
know
Right.
I mean, like, do you regularly go to a therapist and do you have a mentor? Do you
Right.
have people in your life that you ask to hold you accountable?
Yep.
Because building those systems, right, or that rhythm or routine is what leads to healthy habits.
Yep.
And right, because what does John Chris say, like, we all be backsliding, you know so it's going to happen
Right.
at
Right.
times, but I think just that having because I was, even when I've been through a lot of therapy myself, on
Hmm.
and off, I should say,
Hmm.
and now I'm just going consistently.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and I think that's advice for all of us, right? Regardless of whether you are wired like an Enneagram 3 or an Enneagram 9,
Yeah,
get yourself a trained therapist
yeah,
and for sure at least a sounding board to that's beyond your family and friends and work
yeah,
people, right?
yeah,
Someone that's outside of the system that can give you a little bit of perspective on what's going on,
yeah.
regardless of where you're at in your development.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Maybe
Yeah.
it's time for a check-in. Maybe it's time for a
Yeah.
checkup. But I don't like, or the people who say I've done that. Well, I don't know if it ever stops being beneficial. Um,
It's
now
this,
and we're broad stroking a little bit, right?
sure.
To find the right person to connect with and trust, and that applies to a therapist, a mentor.
Absolutely.
All it does. It might not be the first one. right?
Absolutely. I
And it's no,
completely
yeah,
agree. And I
yeah,
think that's a really good point
yeah,
because just because you've tried therapy once and it didn't work doesn't mean it doesn't work. Just
yep,
because you found a therapist that works doesn't mean that's the only thing you need, right?
yep.
It's learning what stage of life you're in and what you need along the way.
And then on that mentoring piece, I know people who didn't have a click with their first mentor,
Mm,
right? And
right,
so like and then even understanding what like I've got different mentor relationships where one is more about this and one is more about
right,
that, like even understanding what it is, right?
right,
So
right. Well, and
yeah.
to tie this all with a bow again is this brings us back to connection, is finding
Yes.
those humans that you connect with and that you can
Yes.
be yourself and go on that journey with.
And not doing it alone. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me, Kevin. Lots of wisdom and insight. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Have a lovely day.
You as well.